All right. Good noon, everybody. Welcome back to Lunch Break Apostasies. We are almost done with our series. We're on the very last lesson today. And I got to tell you, it's going to be a weird one. I mentioned to you a couple times ago, we were going to be doing specials for these last two, not necessarily ones I would normally concern myself with mentioning, um, except because we're in a unique context here, a context which doesn't mean I'm wasting anybody's time necessarily. Like if you think that the topic is useless, then you can just click away. It's not going to bother me at all. Last time we talked about the United Church of Christ. We didn't receive any questions on that, by the way, which is probably just as well since it is a special. That being said, I'll tell you here, we're going to be continuing a series after this once we're done with the Apostasies. I'll tell you more about that later. Once again, feel free to ask any questions or comments. The comments are open under the Facebook Live profile there. And of course, you can message me afterwards, and I'll try to get to that as well. But we'll talk more about the upcoming series later. As far as something to look to that is good about the apostasy when it comes to the United Church of Christ, and really, if you saw the last one, you know that we talked more really about the eclectic movement of the 20th century in general rather than just the United Church of Christ. But with the United Church of Christ specifically, I would say that it is admirable the focus they put on making a change in the world around them. I think that's something wonderful. And sometimes I believe that Christians can get a little bit too focused on the spiritual only. Now, don't mistake me, the spiritual side should absolutely be our priority. But sometimes we get so wrapped up in the spiritual that we forget that we are commanded to make a physical difference on the world as well. Something, and as an example of that, you might run into somebody with the idea that benevolence can only be done if it is has a evangelical purpose behind it, right? If I help somebody out, maybe they'll come to church, which is, that's a fine attitude to have, but that's not the only reason you ever ought to give. One of the reasons the church exists is benevolence. Um, so I appreciate the focus on doing good on this earth. Unfortunately, they tend to take it too far. Many would state that their purpose is to create a heaven on earth. Well, that's vanity. Doesn't matter how benevolent you are, you're never going to eliminate poverty. Jesus said so. You're never going to eliminate all the problems of the earth. Furthermore, you can't attempt to put your methods, that's politics, your methods of fixing this problems as the only way to go about doing it. That makes you a politician, not a Christian. And so, unfortunately, it goes way too far with this. But at least they do have a focus on benevolence, which we appreciate. All right, moment you've all been waiting for. Let our topic for today is Scientology. The reason I'm a little bit exasperated at the idea of doing this is because, as you will see, this one is not so serious when it comes to its theology. I mean, they take themselves quite seriously, don't get me wrong, but as we'll see, I'm going to try to stick to my rules of not being overly snarky. That being said, I think you'll be able to see for yourself why that's going to be a little bit difficult for me. The reason this one was not put up with is because it's never really been a major force in the religious world. Really, it's interesting how a small organization, relatively small organization, can have such a large impact, culturally speaking, even if they aren't really that big or influential on the, on the grand scale of things. That being said, uh, they they're declining as well. The most famous thing, I suppose, about Scientology, at least historically, is that it was sort of the religion of celebrities. A few people, notably, such as Tom Cruise, John Travolta, Kirstie Alley, until she passed away a couple years ago, they were all members of the Church of Scientology. And then more recently, it's come into view because of the controversies around it. A former celebrity member of it, Leah Remini, she ended up putting out, I believe, a whole docu-series about it when she ended up leaving the church. And when you look at the long, and it's a long celebrity list of members, you'll notice that most of the celebrities who are members of this, they're aging. There don't seem to be much positive recruitment efforts for celebrities any longer for Scientology. And so Tom Cruise is certainly the big champion of it. They don't really seem to be able to garner many new members, partially because of the darker sides of Scientology becoming more commonplace. And what you'll typically see when you see these documentaries are talking about the abuses of Scientology, and there are a lot of them, although that's the sort of thing we have not focused too awful much when talk. I mean, we've talked about some of the abuses of some of these apostasies, but that's not never been the focus. Of these, we've been trying to talk about what the doctrines are. That being said, I have not shied away from mentioning some of the more controversial things that have happened, and that will be the case with Scientology as well. So starting off with Scientology, we, as normal, will start with the founder. And the founder of Scientology is a man named L. Ron Hubbard. He was born in 1911. He was a military brat, as we might call him. And he starts off life, as many military children do, moving around a lot. He was initially supposed to be a civil engineer, I believe. Went to George Washington College, but dropped out after a couple of years and instead pursued a career as a science fiction writer. Ended up writing a couple of fairly successful books, actually. During World War II, he ends up serving, much as his father did, as a naval officer. His father was a World War I naval officer. He's a World War II naval officer. Now, the story from Scientologists about his military career is going to differ greatly from what actual military records show. Scientologists will typically claim that he was a war hero, but the military record shows that he never actually left the United States. I mean, he was a naval officer, but he basically ran patrols off the coast. And there were a couple of incidents which made his military career not so well distinguished. He had two times during his career which he apparently had naval engagements. Now, if you're thinking it's a little weird that a World War II naval officer who only patrolled the American coast had naval engagements, that's weird. I've never heard of any battles or really anything significant happening there. You are right. There really weren't all that many. We were relatively safe on the American coast. Apparently, he once fired on a log he believed to be a German U-boat off the course of Oregon, I want to say, and later off the off the coast of California. It's believed he fired on an island in which he believed to have Japanese troops, and it turned out that that island was owned by Mexico, which was a U.S. ally during the war. And so he ends up being demoted a couple of times during that and having a very undistinguished military career. He makes several extreme unsubstantiated claims around from that time, including that apparently he had been cured from blindness during World War II. His medical records of the time show nothing of the sort. Another is that he had been made a blood brother of the Blackfeet tribe of Native Americans, American Indians, whatever you want to call them. And this also happened to match a book he had written at the time. And so it's a nice little about the author that he explains that he had gone through some of the things his main character supposedly did. Briefly joined Aleister Crowley's cult. Now, if you don't know who Aleister Crowley was, during the early 20th century, he had a reputation as the wickedest man on earth. He was a Satanist before the modern Satanist churches came about. And it is said that he would go through some bizarre, violent, and sexual rituals in order to try to summon demons. Did some awful things. He absolutely deserved that title, wickedest man on earth. And it wasn't just because, some people, if they see idolatry or the worshiping of Satan, and they get a title like wickedest man on earth, some people would say that is ridiculous. There are worse things you can do than that. Well, I might find that objectionable, but what you probably couldn't find objectionable is he was also committing rape and pedophilia in order to do those things. Probably deserves that title. Um, anyway, Hubbard briefly joined that cult and was involved with a friend of his and their wives together, and they attempted several rituals to impregnate one of the women with the spawn of Satan. Luckily, this didn't exactly work out. Um, his criminal career in the late 40s doesn't show a whole lot. However, he did commit petty theft in the form of writing a couple of bad checks back in the day. He also briefly committed bigamy by marrying his second wife while still married to his first. Had a child with them, her as well. It's also said that he stated that if a man wants to make $1 million, the best way would be to start his own religion. The Church of Scientology denies that he ever said that, by the way, but um, if he didn't say that, he certainly seems to have lived it. He tried to make a living as a Scientology or a science fiction writer, is not really able to do so, and when he starts getting into the more religious side of things, um, then yeah, he starts making money big time. All right. For the remainder of this, we're going to talk about some of the features of Scientology. And I decided to organize this in an unusual way. I'm going to organize this as if you are entering Scientology yourself. So we're going to talk about the things that you would see as you drifted into Scientology. What would initially attract you to Scientology? It might be L. Ron Hubbard because he's sort of famous as a science fiction writer and as a hypnotist at this point. He's a shyster, but he does have a certain amount of fame. But also, you might be attracted to the practice of Dianetics. Now, Dianetics is a pseudoscience which was developed to supposedly be the next step, basically, from psychological counseling, right? Picture somebody on the couch, and of course, my cartoon brain goes with some Sigmund Freud type character writing down notes as the person on the couch is talking about their parents or whatever, right? Well, you take this, and Dianetics is supposed to be the step above that. He claimed to have developed Dianetics after much research and consultation with psychologists. And the basic process of Dianetics, he also wrote a book by that name, is the process of auditing, which, as we mentioned, is similar to counseling. Basically, you have two people involved. There's a picture of a Dianetic process going on right now. You have the auditor, that's the counselor, and then the pre-clear. We'll talk about what that is in a bit. The pre-clear is the fella in the striped shirt there, over that's facing the camera here. And the idea with the pre-clear is you're trying to get them to remove all engrams from themselves. What is an engram? An engram is a trauma that happened at some point in one's past, which is still causing problems. And you can see that there's definitely similarities to modern psychological counseling, right? I'm no counselor myself, and so I'm not going to claim to be an expert on these things. And any of my friends who might know more about this than me can correct me if I'm wrong, but often a common thing within counseling, of course, is to go back into one's past, see how certain traumas might have been affecting them today, and to try to work through said traumas, especially, for example, if you're treating something like PTSD. Once again, I'm no psychologist. This is sort of my perception of how it works, but often that is something that might be associated with counseling. Well, that's certainly in Dianetics what you're doing. You're supposed to go to these traumas which are affecting current behavior. These are known as engrams. So let's say, for example, that as a child, your aunt would beat you viciously. What you would do is you are going to go into one of these auditing sessions, and rather than talk about how this is affecting you today necessarily, we're going to go back and we're going to find these engrams, and we're going to use techniques very similar to hypnotism. And so rather than talking about maybe this is affecting you in a certain way today, we're just going to have you repeat what happened, right? My aunt beat me as a child. Say it again. My aunt beat me as a child. Say it again. My aunt beat me as a child. Say it again 10 more times. My aunt beat me as a child, etc., etc., etc. And several other bizarre hypnotic-like techniques. By the way, hypnosis is an effective tool. You can actually hypnotize somebody, but it doesn't really work in the way it does in the movies. It sort of has to happen willingly, so I suppose you can say it's not a real thing at all. But hypnosis certainly does have a psychological effect on people, especially if they're willing to allow it to happen. Well, this is using several hypnosis-like techniques, and you'd find out what the engrams are, and then you determine which technique needs to be used in order to clear an engram. And an auditing session is complete when an engram is completely removed from a person. That device they're using is called an E-meter. You notice those two little nodes that the pre-clear is holding in that picture. That's a tool used by the auditor to determine which techniques are needed in order to clear, it is believed, the engrams. Now, I should mention at this point that the entire process of Dianetics has been, as far as I can tell, fairly universally disavowed by the psychological community as a pseudoscience, and I certainly believe that to be the case. Yeah, as we mentioned, many of this is using hypnotism-like techniques. Now, the goal of all of this is to clear all of the engrams, and so if somebody finishes the process of Dianetics, they are considered cleared. And it is supposed, I don't know if they really advertise this that much anymore, but it was certainly at the beginning supposed that if somebody is cleared, that they're going to be able to do certain things. Many of them are benefits which you might expect from modern counseling, right? The ability to act free from past traumas and in a more rational and more healthy way towards certain things. But then you have other bizarre things like superhuman memory, even psychic powers I've seen claimed a couple of times should be as a result of being cleared. Now, the first, I believe it was a woman, was the first one that Hubbard claimed to have cleared using Dianetics. And she ends up being tested on this and fails miserably, right? They asked her to recall what she had for breakfast a couple of weeks ago. She couldn't do that. Gave her a math problem, and she was unable to complete it. And at one point, while this woman was being shown off, the crowd told Hubbard to turn around and then asked her what color tie he was wearing, and she was not able to recall that either. So obviously, you got some serious problems here. Now, you might wonder what the point of all of this is, if there's not actually any purpose to it. Well, the purpose, as so often is the case, is money. Because these sessions are expensive beyond belief, and they get more expensive. It's several long sessions that you're going through, taking all of this information and going through all the traumas that are supposedly have happened within your life, and they get more and more expensive as you go on. Most Scientologists do not really get past the basic Dianetics stage simply because they can't afford it. In addition, because you might recall we talked about the international churches of Christ when we talked about the Restoration movement, and I talked about some of their cult their cult like uses and how they manage to trap people within the cult. Well, one of the things they do is you talk one-on-one with one that is called a prayer partner. And all of the time, you're giving them the sensitive information, and you're trusting them, and you really shouldn't, because they are going to use this information to blackmail you into staying within the cult and to control you using that information. Well, Scientology famously does the exact same thing. So maybe one of your engrams was something that you did. In fact, one of the steps in the process is to talk about how you victimized somebody else. Well, we might just use that information against you should you ever become a problem for us. All right, let's say you get pretty far into the process of Dianetics, right? You've been a good Scientologist, you've been paying your dues, you have gone through this process, and you have removed a lot of the engrams. Well, the group might decide you're ready to move up to the next stage. And this is, the whole time, of course, they have been controlling of your life. They are making sure that you can see that there's something more to this that they're not telling you, right? They're holding up the curtain, and when people get to a certain point, then they get to know the secret too. And wow, how great is that? It's going to be it makes the huge difference in their life, but they don't tell you immediately. They make you invest in it. Ever hear of the broken window fallacy before? They abuse it, right? You've put all of this time and money into this. You've got to know what the secret is. Later on, Hubbard would develop the more religious side of Dianetics, which we call Scientology. And it all has to go around with the Thetans. What they'll do is they'll take you into a private room after, of course, you've paid enough money to get into it. And they're going to let you in on the secrets after you've been dying to know for this long. For a while, the outside world didn't know what this was, but the cat's pretty well out of the bag at this point. Enough high-ranking Scientologists have left the religion to tell us what they were told. And they are going to tell you about Thetans. Now, anything that comes up in this particular slide, I believe it is still policy of the Church of Scientology to deny. In fact, one of the claims, I think it was Leah Remini who actually said this, but she was told that if anybody ever asks you about any of this, you aren't to deny it, but you are supposed to say, you sound crazy when you say it. So this is supposed to be the big secret of Scientology. The secret is having to do with Thetans. All mortal beings have an immortal, essentially a soul, known as a Thetan. What you are, in essence, is a Thetan, according to Scientology. However, your body is not made up of just your Thetan, but of several Thetans, and so you have essentially lived several lives before this one. High-ranking Scientologists, perhaps the lower-ranking ones wouldn't know this, although I think it's well documented at this point that I'd be surprised that if there were Scientologists who didn't know about this now, but at the time, it was the lower levels weren't supposed to know this. Your body is made up of several, probably hundreds, maybe thousands of different Thetans, of lives that have been lived, and they are within your memory. And the engrams, remember those traumas from the past lives, affect your personal Thetan because these Thetans are within your body. And so Dianetics can be used to further remember the traumas of the past lives as well, and remove the engrams that are affecting them, thus removing the Thetans from your body and making life more clear for yourself. That's the belief. And so, very advanced Dianetics is going to have people recalling their past lives using, once again, these hypnotic techniques. And um, they are going to remove them. You're going to recall the past traumas, and you're going to remove them using the exact same methods. Well, many of the thetans that are part of your body are also human thetans. Not all thetans are human thetans. There's a famous story. One guy ends up leaving the Church of Scientology after hearing a man claim to remember his life as an oyster. Um, but many of the thetans that make up your body have gone through an extreme trauma, one really big engram, which was before the beginning of human civilization. Humans are actually aliens, and there's a galactic empire. They live on several planets. Well, there was a great war centered around the space emperor known as Xenu. And Xenu uh, took many of his enemies, human enemies, to the planet Earth, and essentially Earth is uh, I guess almost a penal colony, except he executed everybody who was on Earth by throwing them into volcanoes and then hitting said volcanoes with hydrogen bombs. I am not joking with you. I am not making a single part of this up. They really believe this. Um, And so those human beings, those thetans, make up most of our bodies today. That's obviously an extreme engram that has to be removed, but it can be removed. And if you remove those thetans from yourselves, they get to go back into the reincarnation cycle and live happy lives in the future. And then you will also gain certain benefits as well from removing those engrams from your basic physiology. Eventually, Xenu was overthrown himself and is still imprisoned in some sort of electric fortress, I believe, to this day, somewhere. I'm not really sure where it's supposed to be. Maybe it's supposed to be on Earth. I don't know. Um, by the way, several of these human beings, because of the engrams, into being reincarnated on Earth, but as extremely primitive human beings, cavemen, and then society comes back to it's extremely similar to the stories of Halo and Mass Effect. By the way, I imagine they were probably influenced by this a little bit, and you'll notice there are several science fiction stories that move in a similar way. The show Ancient Aliens also works on a very similar premise. If you can remove all of the thetans from yourself by removing their engrams as well, you will also gain some powers, and this is where some of the really incredible stuff. You'll be able to move stuff with your mind. And by the way, if you can't, that means you haven't removed all of the thetans or the engrams of the thetans, and thus the thetans from yourself. And so you'll have to retake the courses. By the way, did I mention these are extremely expensive courses costing in the thousands of dollars? Yeah, that's that's sort of the big scam when it comes to Scientology. Now, I'm sure at this point I haven't had to be snarky in order for you to be laughing at this. It's kind of okay because when somebody tells you something that is that absurd and tells you people actually believe this, the natural human reaction is to laugh hysterically at it. I promise you, you're not a bad person for laughing at it. If you are ever in the unlikely case where you're studying with a Scientologist, don't laugh at them uh, because it is going to ruin your credibility. But just so you know, it's perfectly natural to find this laughable. And you might be asking yourself the question, then why on earth would anyone believe this hogwash actually happened? I did an April Fool's prank a couple months ago talking about the apostasy of Sauron in the Lord of the Rings. If I presented to you that as an actual religion, it would be more believable than this. It is obviously a work of fiction from a science fiction writer, and it's not even really all that an original one. So why does anybody believe it? Well, it's interesting how he managed to use the psychology of this. I mentioned already that there are a lot of celebrities who are within this cult. Um, and the way they do this is devious. Is a certain type of person who is attracted to this. First of all, they tend to be a little bit narcissistic in personality wise. Once again, I'm no psychologist. I'm not making a diagnosis here. I'm just saying that the thing that attracts people to the religion initially is Dianetics, which is telling you essentially that we're going to spend all of our attention on just you, right? And we're going to talk about you, which is everybody's favorite subject. We're going to talk about you, and we're going to spend all our attention on just you. And by the way, all the problems you have, they're not really your fault. They're the fault of these engrams, and most of them aren't even within your own lifetime. Further on, you're going to find that. You can see how that might appeal to somebody who has a narcissistic personality trait. Most celebrities, by the way, once again, I'm not diagnosing them. I'm using narcissism in the non-psychological term. I'm just saying they love themselves. It's very obvious they love themselves. They think very highly of themselves. And people who think very highly of themselves are attracted to this religion. By the way, as a side note, stop worshiping celebrities. They are not good people. Almost none of them have positively contributed to your life or anybody else's. Don't worship celebrities. You're not helping them. Quit it. Just quit it. But anyway, the celebrities are attracted to this because it feeds into the narcissism. Once again, I'm not making the diagnosis, so if you want to replace the term narcissism with they very clearly think highly of themselves, then fine, whatever you want to do on that. Anyway, you catch people in. I mentioned that broken window fallacy, the idea that I have already invested invested a lot into something. I am therefore losing something if I break out of it. So it uses that a lot. I paid all this money into it, and these people who are so smart, they believe all of this. That's how people get trapped into this. It's very clever how they've managed to deceive people into that. Luckily, as I said, their influence seems to be waning. Now, let's say that they've told you all this information. By the way, it just so happens that this is what Hubbard developed after Dianetics. Part of the reason he felt the need to do this was because Dianetics, as a practice, was starting to fail. He made the mistake of writing a book, practice talking about the practice, and when people tried it at home, and obviously it didn't work, he lost credibility. So this time he's learned his lesson and he's keeping all of it a big secret. Well, let's say you start to go up the ranks, which by the way costs money in Scientology. You might eventually be invited into the Sea Org, or Sea Organization, but Sea Org for short. In '67, Hubbard bought 3 ships, which he rechristened to the Diana, Athena, and the Apollo. The Apollo serving as the flagship. After running into problems of taxation from the governments, I believe at this point Scientology had lost its religious tax-exempt status with the U.S. government. I don't know. I know to this day they are not tax-exempt in Australia and a few other countries. But unfortunately, they are once again tax-exempt in America. But in order to evade some of this, he ends up christening these 3 ships and then headquarters Scientology out on sea. So, hey, if you're in international waters, you can't get taxed on it. For several years, he took these ships around the world to house the top-ranking Scientologists. Now, you might be thinking, hey, I paid a whole lot of money to get into the Sea Org, and this is the very top of Scientology, and hey, there's a lot of money in this cult, so, this is where it's going to be great. No. The conditions were very poor for the vast majority of the Scientologists within the Sea Org. Given very little in the way of luxury. This was no pleasure cruise. They were given very basic food and not very much, and no more than was necessary to live. Not really anything in the form of pleasure. In order to get into this, by the way, they had to sign a billion-year contract. Remember, they believe in reincarnation, so your next life and a whole lot of lives after that, you're going to be working for Scientology. Not allowed to contact the outside world. Very strict code of conduct as well. You were allowed to get married, but if you had children, you were kicked out of the Sea Org. And it goes on this way for nearly 10 years. Eventually, they move back to America, to a place that they christen Gold Base, and to my understanding, that's where the headquarters remains to this day. Um, Scientologists today have been known to use physical and legal intimidation and harassment against those who they deem to be antagonistic towards the organization, and that includes those who would simply wish to investigate the organization. Now, in that picture over there of the Sea Org, you see that there's a kind of a shorter guy, front and center. If I can get back there. There we go. That guy was one of the highest ranking members of Sea Org and remained that way until the death of L. Ron Hubbard, and I believe that was in '86. Now, let's say you've made it all the way through the ranks of Scientology. You've gone through Dianetics. You've gone through the creation myths, and you have gone through Sea Org. Well, if you've done all that, then your name is David Miscavige, that short guy in the front, and he is currently the head of the Church of Scientology. After Hubbard, and this is the line that they typically use, he didn't die, he just found a way to continue without the use of his physical body. Many ex-Scientologists claim that Hubbard is supposed to be held in a higher esteem than even God within Scientology, because he was the one who was able to figure out this great mystery of life. And so, by the way, there's a very famous video of Tom Cruise at a Scientology meeting of some sort. I don't know if it's a convention or whatever, but he takes a moment to salute an image of Hubbard, and it sort of gives you an indication of how much deification you have going on here. Miscavige takes over leadership as the head of the Church of Scientology in '86. Under his leadership, the church has sued many organizations they deem antagonistic towards them, including the IRS. I mentioned that they lost their tax-exempt status. For several years, there was a legal battle between the church and the IRS. The IRS claimed they owed a lot in back taxes. And of course, by the way, they're just this is a scam organization that is using the term church in order to prevent itself from being taxed. It was absolutely right for it to lose its tax-exempt status, but nevertheless, it managed to keep it, and they ended up winning that legal battle. And today, for the time being, Scientology is a tax-exempt organization. But they've also sued people who have been critical towards them. They have used intimidation techniques. And there are many allegations around Miscavige specifically, including that in the headquarters, he supposedly beats staff and makes public examples of them. His wife, Shelley, has not been seen except briefly, for a very long time, except briefly in 2007. I believe that was during her father's funeral. The LAPD has, and by the way, they are based out of California, the LAPD claims to have interviewed her in 2013, and so they closed a missing persons report about her, though they won't give any details about it, which is strange. There are many who still claim she is being held against her will somewhere in Scientology property. Another bizarre thing, Flo Barnett, who is the mother of Shelley Miscavige, she was she was killed in 1985, and it was after leaving the church. Apparently she was shot several times, and she was very critical of the church, although Miscavige denies any sort of connection to that. Honestly, if you want to know more about that, really the several documentaries about Scientology could probably do a better job of telling you about some of these specific accusations against the church. But anyway, like I said, chances are you're probably never going to run into a Scientologist. It's dying. They're more aggressive lately, and when you do Google searches, they've been pretty good about trying to make sure that their message is the first one that shows up. And that might fool a few people. Nevertheless, if you're intelligent about it, you're not gonna, and you look at all sources as you should, you're gonna find out pretty quickly that there's no good coming out of this organization. All right, that's the Church of Scientology for you. A quick little overview. Like I said, if you want to look more into it, you can. Probably not going to be super useful for you in an evangelistic sense, but hey, um, I find it interesting. At least maybe you do too. I mentioned that we're going to talk about what our new study is going to be. And it's not going to be next week. I'm going to be spending a couple of weeks at West Virginia Christian Youth Camp, which, hey, by the way, great place to send your kids if you got that option. I think it makes a fantastic difference in the lives of countless young people. Wonderful place to send your kids. Highly recommend you do that. But after I come back, we're going to start a new study, and it is going to be in the book of Judges. Our first class when we return, it's going to be a quick overview, so it should only be a few minutes before we, an introduction before we get into it. And then after that, we'll start a regular class based around the book of Judges. So I hope you can join me for that. Until then, I look forward to speaking with you again. Love you all, and I'll see you next time.